In the grand throne room of Blackmore Castle, a single desperate cry shatters centuries of tradition. "Please, take me with you, my father." The words, spoken by a mud-stained peasant girl to the most powerful man in the kingdom, ignite a scandal that threatens to topple a dynasty. What could drive a simple village girl to risk everything with such an audacious claim? And why does the stern King Edmund, against all reason and protocol, not immediately condemn her for her brazen lie? As whispers race through the castle corridors and nobles plot in shadowed alcoves, a 20-year-old secret begins to unravel, one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, truth, and the thin line between deception and destiny. What happens when a desperate lie accidentally reveals the kingdom's most dangerous truth? And what shocking decision will the king make that leaves the entire court breathless with disbelief? The great hall of Blackmore Castle fell silent as the heavy oak doors burst open. A cold gust of autumn wind swept through the chamber, causing the torches to flicker wildly against the stone walls. The assembled nobility, adorned in their finest velvets and silks, turned as one, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage at the interruption of the royal audience. There, framed in the doorway, stood a girl no more than 17 summers old. Her simple woolen dress was torn and caked with mud, her dark hair tangled with leaves and twigs, as though she had traveled through forest and field without rest. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was something in her eyes, a fierce determination that seemed at odds with her station. "Seize her!" bellowed the captain of the guard, his hand already reaching for his sword. Two guards moved forward, their armor clanking against the marble floor. The girl ducked past them with surprising agility and rushed forward, falling to her knees in the center of the hall, mere feet from the ornate throne where King Edmund sat watching with narrowed eyes. The court held its breath. No peasant had ever dared such an intrusion. The penalty for such impertinence was swift and severe. "Please," she cried out, her voice echoing through the stunned silence. "Please, take me with you, my father." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The queen clutched her throat, her face draining of color. Even the normally impassive royal advisors exchanged glances of alarm. King Edmund's fingers tightened around the carved armrests of his throne until his knuckles turned white. He leaned forward, his crown glinting in the torchlight, his expression unreadable save for a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "What madness is this?" hissed Lord Blackwell, the king's trusted chancellor. "Your Majesty, allow me to have this filthy creature removed and flogged for her insolence." The girl remained prostrate, her forehead pressed against the cold stone floor, her body trembling. Yet there was no hint of retraction in her posture. Her accusation, or was it a plea, stood firm in the charged air of the throne room. The guards moved forward again, their rough hands reaching for her arms. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The king's voice, when it came, was soft, yet carried to every corner of the hall. "Wait." A single word, yet it froze the guards in their tracks. The king rose from his throne, his crimson cloak swirling around his tall frame. He descended the 3 marble steps with measured grace, each footfall echoing in the breathless silence. He stopped before the girl, and the entire court leaned forward, straining to hear. "Look at me, child," he commanded, his voice betraying nothing. Slowly, the girl raised her head. Tears had carved clean paths down her dirt-stained cheeks, yet her gaze was steady as she met the king's eyes. Something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, or merely the desperate hope of one against the cold scrutiny of the other. "What is your name?" asked the king. "Eleanor, your Majesty," she answered, her voice steadier now. "Eleanor from the village of Oakvale." The name seemed to strike the king like a physical blow. He took a half-step backward, his face suddenly ashen. The court watched, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The king's reaction had confirmed what minutes before would have been dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. "Impossible," whispered the queen, rising from her seat. "Edmund, tell everyone this is a lie. This girl is nothing to you." But the king remained silent, studying Eleanor's features with an intensity that made the courtiers shift uncomfortably. There was something in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the line of her nose that stirred ancient memories, echoes of a time before the crown, before duty had eclipsed all else. "Your Majesty," Lord Blackwell interjected, his voice tight with concern. "Surely you do not entertain this obvious deception. The girl must be punished for her." "Silence." The king's command reverberated through the hall. He turned to face his court, his expression hardened into a mask of royal authority. "No harm shall come to this girl until the truth of her claims is determined. She will remain here under my protection." The pronouncement sent shockwaves through the assembly. Noblemen muttered darkly to one another, ladies whispered behind jeweled hands, and servants in the shadows exchanged meaningful glances. The scandal would spread throughout the kingdom by nightfall. "My lord!" The queen's voice trembled with barely controlled fury. "You cannot possibly—" "I have spoken," the king said, cutting across her objection. He turned back to Eleanor, who still knelt before him, hope and fear battling across her features. With a gesture that left the court gasping, he extended his hand to her. "Come, child," he said, his voice softer now. "You will be given chambers, clean clothes, and food. Tomorrow we shall speak further of these claims." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before placing her small, calloused hand in the king's. He helped her to her feet with a gentleness few in the court had ever witnessed from their stern monarch. The assembled nobility watched in stunned silence as King Edmund himself led the mud-stained peasant girl from the great hall, her hand still in his. Behind them, the whispers began, accusations, theories, and dark predictions spreading like wildfire. As they reached the great doors, the king paused and looked back at his court, his eyes finding the queen's horrified gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a challenge, a confession, or perhaps a warning. Then, without another word, he escorted Eleanor through the doorway and into the inner chambers of the castle, leaving chaos in his wake. The kingdom would never be the same again. The morning sun streamed through the narrow window of Eleanor's chamber, casting long golden fingers across the stone floor. She sat perched on the edge of a wooden bed, the first real bed she had ever slept in, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery of her new gown with wonder. The fabric was softer than anything she had ever touched, dyed a gentle shade of blue that made her eyes appear almost luminous in the morning light. A timid knock at the door startled her from her reverie. A maidservant entered, bearing a wooden tray laden with freshly baked bread, cheese, and a steaming cup of spiced wine. The aroma made Eleanor's stomach growl audibly. She had been too nervous to eat much the previous night. "His Majesty wishes to know if you are comfortable, miss," the servant girl said, her eyes downcast, though Eleanor could see curiosity burning there. "Please thank him for his kindness," Eleanor replied, trying to mimic the refined speech she had heard in the great hall. The words felt foreign on her tongue, yet she knew her survival depended on maintaining this fragile illusion of belonging. As the maidservant departed, Eleanor moved to the window. Below, in the inner courtyard, life in the castle continued. Blacksmiths hammered at their forges, stable boys led horses to water, and kitchen maids hurried across the cobblestones with baskets of vegetables. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension, an electric buzz of gossip that seemed to connect everyone from the lowliest scullery maid to the most decorated knight. Eleanor could almost hear her name on their lips. Meanwhile, in the royal chambers, King Edmund paced before the hearth, his shadow dancing against the tapestry-adorned walls. The queen sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped its ornately carved arms. "Have you taken leave of your senses, Edmund?" she hissed, her voice barely controlled. "To bring that filthy peasant into our home, to clothe her in silk, to feed her from our table? What madness has possessed you?" The king paused in his pacing, his eyes distant. "There is something about her, Margaret, something in her face that I cannot ignore." "So you believe this absurd claim?" The queen's laugh was brittle. "That you fathered a child with some village woman? That this girl, who appears precisely when our son is to be betrothed to the Westland princess, is your lost daughter?" The king's jaw tightened. "I said nothing of belief. I merely said the matter warrants investigation before dismissal." Across the castle, in the lady's solar, a different sort of interrogation was taking place. "Countess Aldith, whose shrewd eyes had missed nothing in yesterday's spectacle, held court among the younger ladies in waiting. "Did you see how he looked at her?" she whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially, as though he'd seen a ghost. Lady Beatrice, the youngest of the group at just 16 summers, gasped. "Do you truly think she could be his daughter? A king's blood in a peasant's veins?" "Stranger things have happened," replied Lady Matilda, who prided herself on knowing the darkest secrets of every noble family in the kingdom. "Remember, before he married our queen, the king spent many months traveling the countryside. Who knows what indiscretions might have occurred?" The whispers spread through the castle like a plague, from the knights' quarters to the stables, from the kitchens to the guardhouse. Each telling grew more elaborate, more scandalous than the last. Some claimed Eleanor was the daughter of the king's long-lost love, spirited away to protect the royal succession. Others insisted she was an impostor, coached by enemies of the crown to create division within the kingdom. In the council chamber, Lord Blackwell gathered the king's advisors, their faces grave in the dim light. "This situation threatens everything," he warned, his voice low. "The alliance with Westland, the stability of the succession, the Queen's position. We must convince His Majesty to send the girl away before more damage is done." Lord Harwick, the oldest of the councillors, stroked his white beard thoughtfully. "And yet I noticed something when she entered the hall. Did none of you see it? The resemblance to the king's mother is unsettling." The statement hung in the air, unwelcome yet impossible to dismiss. Each man there had served the previous queen and recognized the truth in Lord Harwick's observation. The same high cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw, the same unusual flecks of gold in otherwise dark eyes. Back in her chamber, Eleanor sat alone with the weight of her deception pressing down upon her like a physical burden. She had never planned to claim royal blood. The desperate words had tumbled from her lips when she faced the guards. A wild gamble born of terror and the stories her foster mother had told her throughout childhood. Tales of noble blood and secret births that had seemed like mere fairy stories meant to comfort an orphaned child. Yet the king had not denounced her. He had looked at her with recognition, with something akin to fear. And now, with each passing hour, her lie grew more substantial, taking root in the fertile soil of court intrigue and royal secrets. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened to reveal a stooped figure in simple robes, Brother Thomas, the ancient monk who had served as the king's confessor since childhood. "His Majesty requests your presence in the private chapel," he said, his rheumy eyes studying her face with unsettling intensity. "There is a matter of documentation to discuss." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed the old man through twisting corridors. What documentation could possibly exist? Had her desperate lie somehow stumbled upon a truth she had never imagined? As they walked, a messenger raced past them, clutching a sealed parchment. Eleanor caught only a glimpse of his face, but the urgency in his expression sent a chill down her spine. Something significant had arrived at the castle. News that might either cement her position or destroy it utterly. In the servants' quarters, a kitchen maid whispered to a stable boy, "They say a messenger arrived from the Blackwood convent with an ancient record, births and deaths from 20 years past." The stable boy's eyes widened. And, the maid continued, leaning closer. "The king turned white as death when he read it. Whatever's written there, it's shaken him to his core." Eleanor knew none of this as she followed Brother Thomas into the small, incense-filled chapel. She knew only that with each step deeper into the castle, she moved further from any possibility of retreat. Whether her claim was truth or falsehood no longer mattered. She had set forces in motion that were beyond her control, beyond perhaps even the king's control. As the heavy chapel door closed behind her with a sound like distant thunder, Eleanor faced the king across the altar. His expression was unreadable in the flickering light of 100 candles, but the parchment in his hand trembled slightly. "Sit, child," he said, gesturing to a wooden bench. "There is much we must discuss about your origins." The royal chapel stood silent save for the gentle hiss of candles and the distant moaning of wind through ancient stone. Eleanor perched on the edge of the wooden bench, her fingers twisting nervously in the folds of her borrowed gown. Before her, King Edmund unfurled a weathered parchment with careful, almost reverent movements. The yellowed document bore the distinctive seal of Blackwood Convent, a raven perched upon a cross, half melted yet still recognizable in the fading wax. "This arrived not 1 hour past," the king said, his voice unnaturally steady. "A record from 20 years ago kept by the sisters who serve at Blackwood." Eleanor's throat constricted. 20 years, her age or near enough. The coincidence sent a tremor through her body that she struggled to conceal. "The abbess writes that they have kept this document sealed since the day it was recorded," continued the king, his eyes never leaving the parchment, "to be opened only upon direct royal command." He laid the document flat upon the altar, his fingers tracing the faded script. "It speaks of a young woman who arrived in the dead of winter, heavy with child. She gave birth there in secret, attended only by the abbess and one trusted sister." Eleanor's breath caught. Her deception had been born of desperation, a wild claim made to avoid the guards' rough hands. Yet now, as the king spoke of secret births and hidden records, a cold finger of doubt traced its way down her spine. Could there be truth hidden within her lie? "The mother's name has been obscured," the king continued, a hint of frustration coloring his words as he pointed to a darkened smudge where ink had been deliberately smeared. "Whether by time or design, I cannot say. But the date," his voice faltered for the first time, "the date aligns precisely with my travels through the eastern provinces, when I was but a young prince." Eleanor stared at the king's face, searching for any resemblance to her own. Their eyes met across the flickering candle flames, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw something. A shared expression, perhaps, or the same angle of brow. "Majesty," she whispered, unsure whether to feed this growing belief or confess her deception before it consumed them both. Before she could continue, the chapel door swung open. Lord Blackwell entered, flanked by 2 members of the King's Council. The Chancellor's face was a mask of diplomatic concern, but Eleanor could sense the fury beneath his composed exterior. "Your Majesty," he began, offering a stiff bow. "Forgive the intrusion, but there are urgent matters requiring your immediate attention. The Westland delegation arrives tomorrow to finalize Prince Aldrich's betrothal. This situation has created complications that must be addressed without delay." The king's expression hardened. "I am aware of my responsibilities, Chancellor." "Then you must also be aware of the dangers this girl presents," Lord Blackwell replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he gestured toward Eleanor. "Even now, rumors spread through the castle like wildfire. The Queen is distraught. The nobles question your judgment. And the Westland ambassador has sent a messenger seeking clarification about this supposed lost heir before their princess arrives." A muscle twitched in the king's jaw. "You overstep, Blackwell." "I speak only out of loyalty, my liege," the Chancellor countered, though his eyes glittered with something that looked remarkably like ambition. "This document proves nothing. A coincidence of dates, nothing more. Any peasant girl could fabricate such a claim, hoping for advancement or riches." Eleanor felt the weight of their stares, the king searching, the Chancellor's contemptuous, the councillors suspicious. The lie she had woven now seemed a fragile thing, ready to unravel at the slightest tug. Yet the king's evident belief in the possibility gave her a strange, guilty courage. "I seek neither advancement nor riches, my Lord Chancellor," she said, amazed at the steadiness of her own voice. "I seek only the truth of my birth." Lord Blackwell's eyebrows rose in undisguised disdain. "How convenient that your truth leads directly to the royal palace. Tell me, girl, who put you up to this? Which of the king's enemies coached you in this performance?" Before Eleanor could respond, the king raised a hand. "Enough. This document, incomplete though it may be, merits further investigation." He rolled the parchment carefully and handed it to one of the silent counselors. "Have the royal archives searched for any record of my movements during that winter. And send word to Blackwood Convent. I wish to speak with the sister who attended this birth, if she still lives." The counselor bowed and retreated, the precious document clutched against his chest. Lord Blackwell remained, his displeasure evident in every rigid line of his body. "Until this matter is resolved," the king continued, "the girl remains under my protection. See that she is treated with respect befitting her uncertain status." The Chancellor's lips compressed into a bloodless line, but he offered another stiff bow. "As you command, Majesty. Though I feel compelled to advise caution, the stability of the realm is my foremost concern." The king finished for him. "As it has been for the 23 years of my reign, do not presume to lecture me on my duties, Blackwell." The rebuke hung in the air between them, sharp as a drawn blade. After a moment of tense silence, the Chancellor withdrew, though Eleanor could feel the promise of retribution in his parting glance. When they were alone again, the king seemed suddenly older, the weight of his crown evident in the slight stoop of his shoulders. He studied Eleanor with a gaze that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone, searching for answers in her very soul. "If you are who you claim to be," he said softly, "it will change everything. The succession, the alliances I have spent decades building, the peace I have maintained through careful diplomacy. You understand this, don't you?" Eleanor swallowed hard. The magnitude of her deception crashed over her in waves of guilt. This was no longer a simple lie to avoid punishment. It threatened an entire kingdom's stability. "I understand, Your Majesty," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. The king sighed deeply, running a hand over his beard. "And if you are not?" He let the words hang between them, the unspoken threat clear enough. A heavy knock at the chapel door saved Eleanor from responding. A servant entered, his face flushed with exertion. "Forgive me, sire, but you asked to be informed immediately. The old confessor has arrived." The king straightened, a new urgency in his movements. "Father Ambrose, he is here already?" "Yes, Your Majesty. He awaits you in the East Tower chamber as you requested." The king nodded, dismissing the servant with a wave. He turned back to Eleanor, his expression grave yet somehow softened by what might have been hope. "Father Ambrose was my confessor in my youth," he explained. "He traveled with me during those years, including that winter in the East. If anyone knows the truth of what happened then, it would be him." He extended a hand, hesitated, then let it fall back to his side. "Rest now. Tomorrow we shall see what light the good Father can shed upon this mystery." As Eleanor was escorted back to her chambers, she felt the weight of the castle's collective gaze upon her. Servants pausing in their duties to stare, guards watching her with suspicious eyes, nobles whispering behind cupped hands as she passed. Her deception had taken on a life of its own, growing and shifting beyond her control. In the quiet of her borrowed room, she sank onto the bed, trembling with the enormity of what she had set in motion. What had begun as a desperate plea to avoid the dungeons now threatened to topple a dynasty. And tomorrow, when she faced the king's old confessor, what then? Would the priest's memories confirm the impossible coincidence, or would they expose her as the fraud she knew herself to be? As night descended upon the castle, Eleanor stared out at the distant stars, wondering if her fate, like theirs, had been written long ago in patterns she was only now beginning to discern. Dawn broke hesitantly over the castle battlements, thin fingers of light probing through a blanket of autumn mist. Eleanor had slept little, her dreams haunted by fragments of a past she had never known, or had perhaps invented in the crucible of her desperation. She stood now at her chamber window, watching as the castle grounds slowly emerged from shadow, wondering if this day would bring her undoing. A soft knock announced the arrival of a maidservant bearing a simple breakfast and news that the king required her presence in the East Tower within the hour. Eleanor picked at the bread and cheese, her appetite diminished by the knot of anxiety that had taken residence in her stomach. She smoothed the folds of her gown, the same one she had worn yesterday, though someone had taken the trouble to press it overnight, and tried to calm her racing thoughts. The walk to the East Tower seemed interminable. Guards flanked her, their expressions impassive but their presence a reminder of her precarious position. Servants scurried past, stealing glances that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Eleanor kept her gaze forward, her chin lifted in an imitation of nobility she had observed in the court ladies. The East Tower rose above the main keep, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Unlike the opulent chambers of the royal apartments, this section of the castle remained largely unadorned, its narrow spiral staircase worn smooth by generations of feet. Eleanor ascended slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. At the top landing, a heavy oak door stood ajar. Eleanor paused, hearing the murmur of voices from within. The king's deep tones were unmistakable, but the other voice, thin and quavering with age, she did not recognize. "Cannot be certain after so many years," the elderly voice was saying. "Memory is a treacherous companion, Your Majesty, particularly when one has seen as many winters as I." "Try, Father," the king urged, a note of barely suppressed tension in his words. "For the sake of the kingdom, if not for my peace of mind." A guard cleared his throat meaningfully, and Eleanor startled, realizing she had been eavesdropping on the royal conversation. She straightened her shoulders, took a steadying breath, and stepped through the doorway. The chamber was small and circular, dominated by a large window that overlooked the distant forest. The king stood with his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the misty landscape. Beside the hearth, hunched in a carved chair that seemed to swallow his frail form, sat the oldest man Eleanor had ever seen. Father Ambrose could not have stood much taller than a child, even in his prime, and now age had curved his spine like a bow. His skin resembled parchment, translucent and covered in a fine tracery of lines stretched over prominent bones. Yet his eyes, when they turned to regard Eleanor, were startlingly clear and blue, like pools of summer sky trapped in winter's grip. The ancient priest's gaze fixed upon her, and something in his expression changed. A flicker of, what? Recognition? Shock? The emotion passed too quickly for Eleanor to name it, but it sent a chill down her spine nonetheless. "Your Majesty," she murmured, dropping into a curtsy as she had seen the court ladies do. The king turned, his expression guarded. "Eleanor, come, meet Father Ambrose, who served as my confessor in my youth." Eleanor approached cautiously, feeling as though she walked on ice that might crack beneath her at any moment. The priest's penetrating gaze never left her face. "Sit, child," Father Ambrose said, his voice surprisingly strong despite its quaver. He gestured to a stool positioned near his chair. "Let me look upon you properly." Eleanor obeyed, perching on the edge of the stool, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The priest leaned forward, his rheumy eyes narrowing as he studied her features with unnerving intensity. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant calls of birds from the forest beyond. "You have your mother's mouth," the old man said suddenly. The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor. Her lie, constructed in a moment of terror, had never included a specific mother, only a vague claim of royal paternity. Yet here was this ancient priest, speaking as though he knew the woman who had borne her. "Father," the king's voice was sharp with warning. "You remember her mother?" Father Ambrose's hands trembled as they rested on the carved arms of his chair. "Majesty, I have kept many secrets during my long service to your family. Some were entrusted to me in confession, sacred and inviolable. Others," he sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Others were kept out of loyalty, or fear, or perhaps simple cowardice." "Speak plainly, Father," the king commanded, though his voice had softened. "I am no longer the impetuous youth you once counseled." The old priest's gaze shifted between the king and Eleanor, a visible struggle playing out on his weathered features. "There was a young woman," he began hesitantly, "during your eastern progress, when you had just turned 20. She was of good family, though not noble. The daughter of a prosperous merchant in Millbrook." The king's face paled. "Eliza Sutton." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Eleanor sat frozen, afraid that any movement might break the spell of revelation. "Yes," Father Ambrose confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She caught your eye at the harvest festival. A bright-spirited girl with a laugh that could warm the coldest heart." The king turned away, facing the window once more, though Eleanor doubted he saw anything of the view beyond. "We spent but a fortnight in her father's town," he said, his voice distant with memory. "It was a youthful indiscretion, nothing more." "Nothing more?" Father Ambrose's frail voice carried a surprising note of rebuke. "Majesty, forgive an old man's impertinence, but you loved her. I saw it with these eyes, dimmed though they have become. And she loved you, enough to keep your secret when duty called you back to court, to your arranged marriage. The king's shoulders tensed. That was 20 years ago, Father. A memory only. Perhaps. The priest's gaze returned to Eleanor, studying her with renewed intensity. Yet memories sometimes take flesh, do they not? I attended Eliza on her deathbed many years later. She made me swear secrecy about what passed between us. A vow I have kept until now. Eleanor hardly dared breathe. The fabric of her deception was unraveling, yet being rewoven simultaneously into something she could never have imagined. Could it be possible? Could her desperate lie have accidentally brushed against a hidden truth? What did she tell you? The king asked, his voice rough with emotion he clearly struggled to contain. Father Ambrose's hands trembled more violently now. She spoke of a child, Majesty, a daughter, born in secret at Blackwood Convent. A child she was forced to give up for the sake of both your futures. The king turned slowly, his face ashen. And this child, what became of her? Given to a childless couple in a distant village, with instructions never to reveal her origins. The priest's eyes never left Eleanor's face. Eliza would not tell me which village, fearing perhaps that the knowledge would prove too great a temptation for a young king struggling with his crown's burdens. Eleanor's mind raced. She had been raised by Marta and Thomas, simple farmers who had always been vague about her origins. Foundling was the word Marta had used, though sometimes, when the winter ale flowed freely, she would whisper fantastic tales of noble blood and secret births. Eleanor had always assumed them to be kind fictions meant to soothe a child who looked nothing like her supposed parents. Father, the king's voice was strained to breaking. Are you saying you believe this girl to be that child? The daughter Eliza and I? He couldn't finish the sentence. The ancient priest's hands stilled their trembling as he reached out to take Eleanor's chin, turning her face gently toward the light from the window. I cannot say with certainty, Majesty. It has been too many years, and these old eyes see more of the past than the present some days. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with surprising tenderness. But there is something of Eliza in this face, and something of you as well, perhaps, in the set of the jaw, the shape of the brow. He released her and settled back in his chair, suddenly looking exhausted beyond measure. I have kept this secret for 2 decades, believing it best for the realm. If I have erred in my judgment, I ask forgiveness. The king stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Eleanor as though seeing her truly for the first time. The silence in the chamber grew thick enough to touch. Then, with a suddenness that startled them all, the door burst open. A messenger entered, breathing heavily from his climb up the tower stairs, clutching a sealed parchment. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," he gasped, dropping to one knee. "An urgent message from Blackwood Convent." The king took the parchment with unsteady hands, breaking the seal with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet chamber. As he read, his expression shifted from intensity to disbelief. "Leave us," he commanded, never taking his eyes from the message. "All of you." The messenger retreated immediately. Father Ambrose rose with difficulty, leaning heavily on a gnarled staff. At the doorway he paused, looking back at Eleanor with eyes that seemed suddenly clearer, more present. "Truth has many faces, child," he murmured, "and sometimes the greatest truths are those we discover rather than those we seek." With those cryptic words, he shuffled from the chamber, leaving Eleanor alone with the king and the mysterious message that had drained all color from his face. For 3 full minutes after the door closed, the king stood motionless, the parchment trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand. Eleanor remained seated, scarcely daring to breathe as the weight of unspoken revelations pressed down upon the chamber. Outside, a solitary raven called, its harsh cry seeming to underscore the tension that stretched between them like a bowstring pulled to breaking. Finally, the king moved to the window, his profile silhouetted against the pale morning light. 20 years, he murmured, more to himself than to Eleanor. 20 years of decisions made, alliances forged, a kingdom shaped by my hand. He turned the parchment over, studying the broken seal as though it might offer some additional insight. And now this. Eleanor's fingers twisted in the fabric of her gown. Whatever the message contained, it had shaken the king to his core. Was it confirmation of her claim, her accidental claim that now seemed increasingly, impossibly true? Or was it evidence of her deception, proof that would see her banished, or worse? Your Majesty, she ventured, her voice barely audible even in the silence of the chamber. The king turned slowly, his face a study in controlled anguish. For the first time, Eleanor noticed the silver threading through his dark beard, the fine lines etched around his eyes. Not just the marks of kingship, but of a man who had lived with secrets and regrets. "The abbess of Blackwood Convent is dead," he said flatly. "Passed in her sleep 2 nights past." Eleanor blinked, struggling to understand the significance. I am sorry for your loss, sire." A mirthless smile touched the king's lips. "She was not known to me save by reputation as a woman of uncommon discretion. It seems that discretion extended even to her final days." He held up the parchment. "This message comes not from her, but from the convent's keeper of records. Upon the abbess's death, a sealed chest was discovered among her personal effects. Inside were documents she had withheld from the official archives, records deemed too sensitive for even the royal scribes." The king's gaze pierced Eleanor, searching for something she couldn't name. Among them was a complete account of a birth that took place there 20 years ago, a birth attended by the abbess herself and one trusted sister, who also has since passed to her reward. Eleanor's heart hammered so forcefully she felt certain the king must hear it. "And what does it say?" she whispered. Instead of answering, the king crossed to the hearth and stared into the flames. "Tell me again, Eleanor of Oakvale, how you came to make your claim before my court. The truth this time, if you have any honor in you." The demand caught her off guard. Eleanor swallowed hard, knowing that her next words might determine not just her fate, but perhaps the future of the kingdom itself. A lie had brought her to this moment. Would truth now destroy her? I lied, Your Majesty," she admitted, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I came to the castle seeking work in the kitchens. The harvest was poor this year and there was little food in our village. My foster parents—" She paused, the word foster suddenly taking on new significance. "The couple who raised me are elderly now. They cannot work as they once did." The king remained silent, his back still turned to her. Emboldened by his lack of immediate condemnation, Eleanor continued. "When the guards caught me trying to slip through the servants' entrance, they were unkind. They spoke of flogging, of the dungeons." Her hands clenched involuntarily at the memory. "I was terrified. The words came unbidden, a desperate plea born of stories my foster mother told me as a child. Tales of noble blood and secret births that I always assumed were mere fantasies to comfort an orphaned girl." She looked down at her clasped hands, shame burning her cheeks. "I never expected to be believed. I thought I would be laughed at, perhaps beaten for my impertinence, but at least it might delay whatever punishment they had planned. I never imagined." She gestured helplessly at their surroundings, at the fine gown she wore, at the king himself. "You never imagined that your lie might contain a seed of truth," the king finished for her, his voice hollow. Eleanor's head snapped up. "Sire?" The king turned from the fire, his expression unreadable. "The abbess's records are quite detailed. The mother's name is clearly stated, Eliza Sutton of Millbrook. The father—" He paused, drawing a deep breath. "The father is recorded as a man of noble birth who cannot be named. The child, a daughter, was entrusted to a couple from Oakvale Village, Thomas and Marta Fletcher." Eleanor's world tilted. Thomas and Marta, her foster parents' names, spoken by the king of the realm. This could not be coincidence. This could not be luck or chance or the fates weaving their capricious designs. This was truth, emerging like a ship from dense fog, its outlines becoming clearer with each passing moment. "They raised me well," she whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "They never told me, never hinted that the stories might be more than fancy. Perhaps they were protecting you," the king suggested, his voice softer now. "Or perhaps they were protecting themselves from the pain of losing you to a heritage they could never provide." He crossed the room and sat heavily in the chair Father Ambrose had occupied, suddenly looking every one of his 45 years. The abbess's record includes one more detail, a detail that answers a question I have carried since Father Ambrose spoke of Eliza's deathbed confession. He met Eleanor's gaze directly. The child born at Blackwood Convent was given a small token to be kept hidden until such time as her true parentage might safely be revealed. Eleanor's breath caught. A token? A necklace, the king said softly. A simple gold chain bearing a pendant in the shape of a swan, the symbol of the Sutton merchant house. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, to the place where such a necklace might rest. But there was nothing there. She possessed no jewelry, had never owned any trinket more valuable than the carved wooden comb Thomas had gifted her on her 16th name day. "I have no such necklace, Your Majesty," she admitted, a curious mixture of disappointment and relief washing through her. Perhaps she was not the king's daughter after all. Perhaps this strange convergence of truth and fiction would unravel, allowing her to return to the simple life she had known. The king's gaze remained fixed upon her face. "The absence of the token does not negate the other evidence, Eleanor. Father Ambrose's testimony, the convent records, the timing of Eliza's association with me, even your appearance. There is something of her in your features, now that I look with clear eyes." He rose abruptly, pacing the chamber with restless energy. "Yet I cannot simply declare you my daughter on such evidence. The succession, the alliances with neighboring kingdoms, the queen's position, all would be thrown into chaos. And there are those at court who would never accept you, regardless of proof." Eleanor understood then the terrible burden the king carried. If she was indeed his daughter, his firstborn, though illegitimate, her very existence threatened the stability he had spent decades building. Yet to deny her, if she truly carried his blood, would be a betrayal of both Eliza's memory and his own honor. "I did not come seeking a crown, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "Only work, and perhaps shelter until the worst of winter passes." The king paused in his pacing, regarding her with a new intensity. "Yet fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, has brought you here to my court at this precise moment. The question is not just who you are, Eleanor of Oakvale, but what your presence here means for the kingdom." A sharp knock at the door interrupted whatever else he might have said. Without waiting for permission, Lord Blackwell entered, his angular face tight with barely controlled agitation. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, but the situation has become untenable. The Westland delegation has arrived a day early. They are at the gates even now. Prince Aldrich is demanding to know why rumors of a base-born heir are spreading throughout the kingdom. And the Queen—" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to Eleanor with undisguised hostility. "The Queen threatens to return to her father's lands if this matter is not resolved immediately." The king's expression hardened into the mask of authority Eleanor had first seen in the Great Hall. "Inform Prince Aldrich that I will meet with him presently. Tell the Westland delegation they will be received with all due honors, and remind the Queen that her place is by my side, particularly in times of difficulty." Lord Blackwell's mouth tightened further. "As you command, sire." "And the girl?" He jerked his chin toward Eleanor without looking at her directly. The king straightened to his full height, every inch the monarch despite the absence of crown or ceremonial robes. "Lady Eleanor will attend the Royal Council meeting this afternoon. All evidence pertaining to her situation will be presented and examined. Until then, she remains under my personal protection." The Chancellor's face flushed with suppressed anger, but he bowed stiffly. "The council chamber at the third bell. I shall inform the members." He withdrew without another word, though his rigid posture spoke volumes about his disapproval. When the door closed behind him, the king turned to Eleanor once more. "Rest now. The hours ahead will test us both." His expression softened momentarily. "Whatever the council decides, Eleanor, know this. I believe there is truth in your claim, accidental though it may have been." As Eleanor was escorted back to her chambers, the weight of the king's words settled around her shoulders like a mantle, heavier than any crown, more binding than any oath. She had come to the castle seeking nothing more than a place in the kitchens. Now she found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to reshape the very kingdom itself. The royal council chamber stood at the heart of the castle's oldest section. Its stone walls witnessed to 5 centuries of debate, diplomacy, and decision. Massive oak beams crossed the vaulted ceiling, darkened by countless years of torch smoke and candle soot. Narrow windows set high in the walls admitted slanting rays of afternoon light that illuminated motes of dust dancing in the air. Eleanor stood just inside the heavy double doors, momentarily forgotten as the assembled nobles argued amongst themselves. The chamber was arranged like a small amphitheater, with 3 tiers of carved benches facing an elevated platform where the king's ornate chair awaited its occupant. Tapestries depicting great battles and royal triumphs covered the walls, their once vibrant colors muted by time. The gathered counselors represented the kingdom's most powerful families, men and women whose bloodlines stretched back to the realm's founding. Their rich garments and jeweled ornaments stood in stark contrast to Eleanor's simple blue gown, making her feel more out of place than ever. She recognized Lord Blackwell standing near the king's empty chair, his thin face animated as he spoke urgently with a white-haired nobleman wearing the silver chain of the Lord Treasurer. "Unprecedented," she heard someone mutter nearby. "The king brings a base-born claimant before the full council. Madness." "Hush," another voice countered. "They say she bears a striking resemblance to the old queen, and there are documents." "Documents can be forged," the first speaker interrupted, "and resemblances manufactured by clever minds seeking advancement." Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the floor, pretending not to hear. She had spent the hours since her meeting with the king in a state of numb disbelief, trying to reconcile the simple truth of her origins, as she had always understood them, with the extraordinary possibility now unfolding. Was she truly the daughter of King Edmund and the merchant's daughter, Eliza Sutton? Or was she merely the unwitting center of a storm brewed from coincidence, court intrigue, and a desperate lie? A sudden hush fell over the chamber. Eleanor looked up to see the king entering through a side door, followed by Prince Aldrich, a young man of perhaps 20 years, whose striking resemblance to his father was tempered by a softer, more scholarly cast to his features. The queen was notably absent. As the assembly rose to their feet, Eleanor felt herself being studied by the prince. His expression revealed nothing, though she thought she detected a hint of curiosity beneath his carefully maintained dignity. The king took his seat, gesturing for the council to be seated as well. Prince Aldrich moved to stand at his father's right hand, while Lord Blackwell assumed a position to the left of the royal chair. "My lords and ladies," the king began without preamble, "we face an unprecedented situation that requires wisdom and discretion. 3 days ago, a young woman appeared in our court claiming royal parentage. Initially, I dismissed this as fantasy or deception. However, evidence has since emerged that warrants serious consideration." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Eleanor remained standing where she was, acutely aware of dozens of pairs of eyes shifting between her and the king. "Chancellor Blackwell," the king continued, "you have examined the documents from Blackwood Convent. Share your findings with the council." Lord Blackwell stepped forward, his expression one of carefully controlled neutrality. "The records appear authentic, Your Majesty. The seal and hand are consistent with those of Mother Agnes, who served as abbess until her recent passing. They detail the birth of a female child at the convent 20 years past. During the same period, Your Majesty toured the eastern provinces as Crown Prince." He cleared his throat delicately. "The mother is identified as Eliza Sutton of Millbrook. The father is recorded only as a man of noble birth who cannot be named. The child was given into the care of a couple from Oakvale Village, the same village from which this young woman claims to hail." Another murmur, louder this time, swept through the chamber. Eleanor could feel the atmosphere shifting, tension building like the pressure before a summer storm. "These coincidences are remarkable," Lord Blackwell acknowledged, "yet they remain circumstantial. Many noble youths toured the eastern provinces that year. The record does not explicitly name Your Majesty as the child's father, and while the timing aligns with Prince Edmund's visit to Millbrook, it could equally apply to several other noblemen who accompanied him." The king's expression remained impassive, though Eleanor noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Father Ambrose has also provided testimony," he said. He attended Eliza Sutton on her deathbed some years ago and received her confession regarding a child born of royal blood. Lord Blackwell's mouth tightened. With all due respect to Father Ambrose's long service, Your Majesty, the recollections of an aged priest regarding a deathbed confession made years past hardly constitute definitive evidence. Memory is fallible, particularly in one of such advanced years. A silver-haired noblewoman leaned forward from the second tier of benches. What of a blood token? Surely if the child was of royal birth, some memento would have been provided to establish her identity when the time was right. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The necklace the king had mentioned, the swan pendant she did not possess. Its absence now loomed large, a void in the narrative that threatened to unravel everything. Before the king could respond, Eleanor found her own voice, surprising even herself with its clarity. "My lords and ladies, may I speak?" The chamber fell silent, shock evident on many faces at her temerity. The king regarded her for a long moment, then inclined his head. "Approach, Eleanor of Oakvale." Heart-pounding, she moved forward to stand before the council. The late afternoon sun caught her face as she stepped into a shaft of light, and she heard several sharp intakes of breath from the older counselors. "I came to this castle seeking only work," she began, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "The claim of royal parentage was born of desperate fear when I was caught entering without permission. I never expected to be believed, much less to discover that my lie might contain elements of truth." She took a deep breath, meeting the gaze of each council member in turn. "I know the name of the woman who bore me." The king sat straighter in his chair. "You claimed your foster parents never spoke of your origins." "They did not, Your Majesty," Eleanor confirmed. "But on her deathbed, the midwife who delivered me broke her silence. She told me only a name, nothing more. She said I should guard it closely, that it might prove either a blessing or a curse depending on the winds of fate." A hushed anticipation fell over the chamber. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, summoning the memory of old Agnes's withered face, her trembling lips forming a name as life ebbed from her body. "Lady Helena Ravenswood," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed across the chamber. An elderly lord in the front row surged to his feet, his face ashen. The king himself seemed frozen, his expression one of absolute shock. "Impossible," Lord Blackwell breathed, all pretense of composure abandoned. "Lady Helena died 20 years ago. She was—" He stopped abruptly, his gaze darting to the king. "She was lady-in-waiting to my mother," the king finished, his voice hollow. "And cousin to Eliza Sutton." Eleanor stood perfectly still as the implications rippled through the assembly. She had spoken the name, believing it to be her birth mother's, not understanding its significance to the court. Now, watching the reaction unfold, she realized she had stumbled upon a truth far more complex, and perhaps more dangerous, than she had imagined. The elderly lord who had risen approached her slowly, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick. His pale blue eyes, rheumy with age, searched her face with desperate intensity. "I am Lord Ravenswood," he said, his voice quavering. "Helena was my daughter. She died of a fever shortly after accompanying the Queen Mother to Blackwood Convent." He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just shy of touching Eleanor's cheek. "But before me stands her very image, the same eyes, the same proud bearing. How can this be?" The king rose from his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury. "A moment, Lord Ravenswood." He turned to Eleanor, his voice dangerously quiet. "You speak of Lady Helena Ravenswood, a woman connected to both the royal household and Eliza Sutton's family. This cannot be coincidence." Eleanor shook her head, confusion evident in her expression. "I know only the name, Your Majesty. The midwife died before she could tell me more. I have carried it like a secret talisman, never understanding its meaning or importance." Prince Aldrich stepped forward for the first time, his scholarly demeanor giving way to sharp intelligence. "Father, I recall a portrait in the Eastern Gallery. Lady Helena in court dress. The resemblance to this woman is unsettling." A tense silence descended upon the chamber as the implications settled over the assembly. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, feeling as though she had stepped into a swift-flowing river whose currents now carried her toward some unknown destination. Lord Blackwell recovered his composure first. "This changes nothing, Your Majesty. Without the blood token mentioned in the abbess's records, we have only circumstantial connections and coincidental resemblances." "Perhaps not," came a wavering voice from the chamber entrance. All heads turned to see a stooped servant woman standing in the doorway, her gray hair escaping from beneath her cap, her work-worn hands clutching something small and gleaming. "Marta Fletcher of Oakvale," she announced, dropping into an awkward curtsy that betrayed her unfamiliarity with court protocol. "I have come for my daughter, and to return what was entrusted to me 20 years ago, when I took a noble infant from Blackwood Convent and raised her as my own." Marta Fletcher's appearance transformed the council chamber from a court of judgment to a tableau frozen in time. The woman who had raised Eleanor stood in the doorway, bent by years of labor, yet somehow dignified in her simple woolen dress and threadbare shawl. Her weathered face bore the same determined expression Eleanor had seen countless times when neighboring farmers tried to cheat them at market or when drought threatened their modest crops. "Guards," Lord Blackwell recovered first, gesturing sharply. "Remove this woman. The council is closed to commoners." "Stay!" The king's command cut through the chamber like a blade. He descended from the dais with measured steps, his gaze never leaving Marta's face. "Let her approach." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as Marta shuffled forward. 20 years of shared meals, gentle hands tending childhood fevers, patient teachings about herbs and weaving, this was the woman who had shaped her, whose love had never wavered despite their poverty. And now here she stood before the king himself, clutching something that glinted gold in the fading afternoon light. "Marta," Eleanor whispered, torn between rushing to embrace her foster mother and remaining rooted where protocol demanded she stand. The older woman's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "My girl, look at you, standing among the high and mighty as though born to it." A sad smile touched her lips. "Perhaps you were, after all." The king's voice was carefully neutral. "You claim to be Eleanor's foster mother." "I claim nothing but what is true, Your Majesty." Marta bobbed another awkward curtsy. "Thomas, my husband, and I took her when she was but days old. A tiny scrap of life wrapped in linen finer than anything we'd ever touched." Her gaze drifted to Eleanor, filled with memories. "They said her mother had died birthing her, and her father could not acknowledge her without bringing ruin to his house. We were childless, and glad of the gift." "And what is that you hold?" the king asked, though the tension in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Marta extended her hand, uncurling gnarled fingers to reveal a simple gold chain from which hung a small pendant. "This came with her. We were told to keep it hidden until she reached her 20th year, or until circumstances demanded its revelation." The pendant caught the light as it dangled from her fingers. A swan in flight, wings outstretched, fashioned from gold so pure it seemed to capture and hold the sunlight. Eleanor stared at it, transfixed. Had this token truly been hers all along, hidden away during her entire childhood? "The swan," breathed Lord Ravenswood, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "The symbol of the Sutton merchant house." His rheumy eyes darted to the king. "And also, if I recall correctly, the personal emblem of a young Prince Edmund during his tournament days." A murmur rippled through the council chamber. The king stood perfectly still, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil Eleanor imagined must be raging within him. "May I?" he finally asked, extending his hand toward the necklace. Marta hesitated only briefly before placing it in his palm. "It was never ours to keep, only to guard." The king studied the pendant, turning it in his fingers so that golden light danced across his face. "I commissioned this," he said, his voice so quiet that those beyond the first row of seats had to lean forward to hear. "From the royal goldsmith 22 years past. Only 2 were made, one for myself and one—" He closed his eyes briefly. "One for Eliza Sutton." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was no longer circumstantial evidence or convenient coincidence. This was physical proof that connected her directly to both the king and the woman named in the convent records. "I do not understand," she said, finding her voice at last. If Lady Helena Ravenswood was not my mother, why would the midwife give me her name? Lord Ravenswood stepped forward, his aristocratic features softened by grief long carried. My daughter was lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. She accompanied the royal party to Blackwood Convent during that winter, officially to seek spiritual counsel for her mistress. His gaze shifted to the king. Unofficially, I suspect, to attend to a more delicate matter. Understanding dawned on Eleanor like a cold sunrise. She was there for Eliza Sutton's confinement, to witness my birth, and perhaps to provide a layer of protection, Prince Aldrich suggested, his scholarly mind clearly piecing together the implications. If questions arose about a noble birth at the convent, attention would naturally focus on Lady Helena rather than a merchant's daughter harboring a royal's child. The king's fingers closed around the swan pendant. Helena was ever loyal to my mother, and by extension to me. She would have done this without question if asked. A shadow crossed his face. I never knew. The fever that took her came so suddenly, mere weeks after that winter. By the time I returned from the Eastern campaign, she was already buried. Marta shifted uncomfortably, unused to standing for so long. Begging your pardon, Your Majesty, but there's more. She reached into a small pouch tied at her waist and withdrew a folded square of yellowed parchment. This came with the babe and the necklace. We were told to keep it sealed until the time came to reveal the truth. Lord Blackwell stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Any such document must be examined by the Royal Chancellor for authenticity. No. The king's voice brooked no argument. This has waited 20 years. It will wait a moment longer while I speak with the woman who raised my daughter. The word hung in the air, my daughter, spoken not as a possibility or a question, but as acknowledged truth. Eleanor felt it settle around her shoulders like a mantle, weightier than any crown. The king turned to Marta, his expression softening. You cared for her all these years, knowing her heritage might one day claim her? Marta nodded, pride evident in her weathered face. We raised her to be honest and strong, to work without complaint, to value wisdom over wealth. If she was to be a peasant all her days, she would be one with dignity. And if her blood called her to higher station, her voice faltered briefly, then she would carry that station with the same grace she showed in our humble home. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. All her life she had known Marta's love had taken comfort in its constancy. Only now did she understand the sacrifice it represented, loving a child fully while knowing she might one day be lost to a heritage beyond their simple world. You have done more than duty required, the king said softly. The crown is in your debt. Marta shook her head. She was never a duty, Your Majesty. She was our daughter in all but blood. She turned to Eleanor, her eyes shining. And she always will be, no matter what title may follow her name hereafter. The king held out his hand for the sealed parchment. Marta surrendered it with the same reluctance with which she had given up the necklace, not from any desire to keep them, but from the recognition that each object represented another severing of the bonds that had defined Eleanor's life until now. With careful fingers, the king broke the wax seal, not the royal crest, but a simpler mark bearing the impression of a small hand. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized it, the same symbol that had marked her childhood wooden toys, carved by Tomas as his personal signature. The king unfolded the parchment, his eyes scanning the faded script. His expression changed subtly as he read, surprise followed by a deep sadness, and finally a grim resolution that settled into the lines of his face like winter frost. When he looked up, his gaze found Eleanor's. This letter is from Eliza Sutton, written in her own hand as she lay dying from childbed fever. She entrusted it to Lady Helena to deliver with her infant to the couple chosen to raise you. His voice caught slightly. She knew she would not survive to see her child grow. The letter trembled in his hand. She writes of our brief time together, of her understanding that duty would call me back to court and an arranged marriage, of her decision to bear our child in secret rather than seek advancement through scandal. He paused, visibly composing himself. She names you Eleonora, after her grandmother, and she asks that you be given this letter and the swan pendant on your 20th birthday. Or should fate bring you into my sphere before then? A hushed silence had fallen over the council chamber. Even Lord Blackwell stood motionless, the political calculations that usually animated his features temporarily suspended in the face of this raw human drama. "There is one more thing," the king said, folding the letter carefully. "A message meant for me, should this letter ever reach my hands." He turned away, the words clearly too private to share with the assembled council. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then from the doorway came a sharp gasp that drew all eyes. The queen stood there, her face pale as death, her hand clutching at the pearls that adorned her throat. Behind her loomed a tall, broad-shouldered man in the distinctive garb of a Westland ambassador. "So it is true," the queen said, her voice cutting through the silence like a winter wind. "You acknowledge this, peasant, as your blood. 20 years of marriage, of loyalty, of bearing your legitimate son. And now this?" The king squared his shoulders. "Margaret, no." The queen raised her hand. "I will not hear excuses or explanations. You have made your choice clear before the entire council." She turned to the Westland ambassador. "You see now why I summoned you, Lord Garrick. The betrothal your princess entered into with my son stands on shifting sands. His very position as heir is now in question." Lord Garrick stepped forward, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, Westland values its alliance with your kingdom most highly, but we cannot ignore such complications when a royal marriage is concerned. Princess Sophia's position must be secure." The king's voice hardened. "My son's place as heir remains unchanged. Eleanor's birth predates my marriage, but she was born of an unwed mother. The laws of succession are clear. Laws can be interpreted," Lord Garrick replied smoothly, "or changed when powerful interests align." His gaze shifted meaningfully around the chamber, where several council members averted their eyes. It was then that a commotion erupted from the corridor. Raised voices, the clatter of boots on stone. A breathless messenger burst into the chamber, his face flushed with exertion. "Your Majesty, a rider from the village of Oakvale. There's a man who claims to have witnessed the birth of the girl. He awaits your pleasure at the castle gates." Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate watercolors of amber and rose, as Eleanor stood alone on the castle battlements, watching the awakening kingdom spread before her. Mist clung to the distant forest and the patchwork of fields beyond, creating the illusion that the castle floated on an island of cloud. From this height, the villages appeared as mere clusters of tiny shapes, smoke rising from early morning fires like fragile threads connecting earth to heaven. One of those distant specks was Oakvale, the only home she had ever known until 7 days ago, when desperation had driven her to the castle gates. 7 days that had transformed her from a nameless peasant girl to the acknowledged daughter of King Edmund of Blackmore, though still baseborn and without formal title. Eleanor wrapped her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders, remembering the chaos that had erupted in the council chamber the previous afternoon. The arrival of Thomas, stooped and gray but still possessing the quiet dignity that had defined him throughout her childhood, had been the final piece in a puzzle she had never known existed. Unlike Marta, Thomas had stood before the king and council without trembling, his gnarled hands steady as he recounted how he had served as stable master at Blackwood Convent during that fateful winter. How he had been awakened one night by Lady Helena Ravenswood herself, summoned to prepare a carriage in utmost secrecy. How he had glimpsed through a half-open door a woman laboring in the birthing bed, attended by the abbess and a single novice. "I saw the babe," he had told the stunned assembly, tiny and red-faced, wrapped in linen fine as gossamer. Lady Helena emerged with the child in her arms, while behind her, the woman who had birthed it lay still as death, her golden hair spread across the pillow. The queen had turned ashen at his words. Lord Ravenswood had wept openly, his dignified reserve crumbling at this account of his daughter's involvement. And King Edmund had listened with the still, terrible focus of a man finally confronting a truth long buried. "Lady Helena entrusted the infant to my wife and me that very night," Tomas had continued. "Said the mother was beyond recovery, and the father could not claim his child without destroying all he was bound by oath to protect. She gave us gold, enough to establish a small holding in a village far from court. And she gave us the necklace and letter, to be kept until the child's 20th year. Or until fate decreed otherwise, Marta had added softly. The council had erupted into arguments after that. Discussions of legitimacy and succession, of diplomatic implications and court protocol. The Queen had stormed out, the Westland ambassador following in her wake. Prince Aldrich had remained, his scholarly face thoughtful as he studied Eleanor across the chaotic chamber. In the end, the king had silenced them all with a single raised hand. "Enough," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "The evidence is conclusive. Eleanor Fletcher, raised by Thomas and Marta of Oakvale, is my daughter by blood, born of Eliza Sutton before my marriage to Queen Margaret. She will be acknowledged as such, though her birth outside of wedlock places her beyond the line of succession. She will be granted estates befitting her heritage, and a place at court, should she wish it. Now, as the rising sun burnished the battlements with golden light, Eleanor tried to imagine what such a life might entail. Courts and palaces, politics and intrigue, these were as foreign to her as the distant shores of Cathay. Yet the blood that flowed in her veins, the heritage revealed by Eliza's letter, and the swan pendant that now hung around her neck, bound her to this world whether she wished it or not. "You rise early, Lady Eleanor," came a voice from behind her. She turned to find Prince Aldrich approaching along the stone walkway, a leather-bound book tucked under one arm. He was dressed simply in riding clothes rather than court finery, his dark hair tousled by the morning breeze. "Not Lady anything," she corrected him gently. "Just Eleanor." A smile touched his lips. "Perhaps for now. But titles have a way of accruing to those of royal blood, regardless of the circumstances of their birth." He moved to stand beside her at the parapet, gazing out at the misty landscape. "You've had quite a journey these past days." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound carrying a note of disbelief. "From kitchen maid to king's daughter, it sounds like one of the tales the village storyteller would spin on winter evenings. Yet unlike those tales, your story lacks a clear ending," Aldrich observed, his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. "The acknowledged daughter of the king, but not quite a princess. Born of royal blood, yet raised to draw water and tend fields." He glanced at her. Where does such a story lead? It was a question Eleanor had asked herself throughout the sleepless night. The king had offered her a place at court, estates of her own, a life of privilege she had never imagined. Yet such gifts came with invisible chains, expectations, obligations, the constant scrutiny of those who would never truly accept her. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything has happened so quickly." "A week ago, my greatest concern was whether our grain stores would last through winter." Aldrich nodded, his expression unexpectedly sympathetic. "And now you must navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, while my mother and half the noble houses regard you as a threat to the established order." "I'm no threat to anyone," Eleanor said firmly. "I have no designs on titles or power. The succession is yours by right and law." The prince studied her face for a long moment. "I believe you," he said finally, "though few others at court will. They'll see only the advantage you might represent to rival factions, a royal daughter who could be married to cement alliances, or used as a rallying point for those dissatisfied with the current regime." Eleanor hadn't considered these implications. The thought of being used as a political pawn sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I could return to Oakvale," she suggested, though even as she spoke she knew it was impossible. Her presence in the village would only bring danger to those she had grown up with. "That path is closed to you now," Aldrich confirmed, echoing her thoughts. "Knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. You are the king's daughter, whether you dwell in palace or cottage." They stood in silence for several moments, watching as the sun's strengthening rays burned away the valley mist. Below, the castle was awakening, servants crossing the courtyard, guards changing shifts at the gates, smoke rising from the kitchen chimneys. "There may be another way," Aldrich said suddenly, "a middle path between court entanglement and impossible return." He hesitated, then added, "If you would hear it." Eleanor turned to face him fully, intrigued despite herself. Throughout the tumult of the council meeting, The prince had been the only one who seemed to regard her as a person rather than a problem to be solved or an advantage to be exploited. "I would." Aldrich glanced around to ensure they were truly alone, then spoke in lowered tones. "For 3 years I have been establishing a small holding in the Western Province, ostensibly as a scholarly retreat, but in truth as a haven for those who need protection beyond what traditional power structures can provide." A rueful smile crossed his face. "My father indulges what he sees as an eccentric hobby, unaware that we shelter everything from disgraced nobles to peasants fleeing unjust lords." "A sanctuary," Eleanor breathed, understanding dawning. "Of sorts," the prince agreed. "We have a small community there, scholars, craftspeople, farmers, even a few minor nobles who preferred obscurity to court intrigues. Each contributes according to their abilities." He looked at her intently. "Someone of your unique position, connected to royalty, yet understanding the common people, could be invaluable in building bridges between worlds that rarely communicate." The idea kindled a spark of hope in Eleanor's chest. A purpose that honored both sides of her heritage, a place where she might belong without pretending to be something she was not. "What of the Queen?" she asked, practical concerns asserting themselves. "And the Westland Alliance? My presence, even at a distance, could complicate matters. My mother will adapt, as she has to all of life's disappointments," Aldrich said, a hint of sadness in his tone. "As for Westland, my betrothal to Princess Sophia can proceed unaffected if you pose no visible challenge to the succession. A quiet roll away from court would reassure them far more than your installation as a lady of the palace." He was right, Eleanor realized. The path he offered might satisfy all parties. The king's desire to acknowledge her, the queen's wish to minimize her impact, her own need for purpose beyond mere existence as a curiosity of royal blood. "Your father may not agree," she pointed out. "Having found a daughter, he may be reluctant to send her away so soon." Aldrich's expression softened. "He will listen to reason, particularly when it serves the greater peace of the realm. And this would not be banishment, Eleanor. You would remain connected to the royal family, but in a way that builds something new rather than disrupting what already exists." The sun had fully risen now, bathing the battlements in clear golden light. Below in the courtyard, Eleanor could see Thomas and Marta speaking with one of the castle stewards, their humble figures standing straight with newfound dignity. They had raised her with love and wisdom, preparing her for a life they could never have imagined. What would they advise her now? As though summoned by her thoughts, the great door to the battlements opened once more. King Edmund emerged, dressed not in royal finery but in the simple attire he might have worn as a young prince traveling the eastern provinces 2 decades ago. The years and responsibilities of his reign were etched in the lines of his face, yet there was something almost boyish in his expression as he approached, a vulnerability Eleanor had not witnessed during the formal proceedings of the council. He acknowledged his son with a nod, then turned to Eleanor. "I hope to find you here," he said quietly. "There is much still to be decided about your future." "Indeed, father," Aldrich intervened smoothly. "Eleanor and I were just discussing possibilities that might honor her heritage while respecting the complexities of the current situation." The king's eyebrow rose. "Were you indeed? And what conclusions have you reached in this early morning council of 2? As Aldrich outlined his proposal, Eleanor watched the emotions play across her father's face. Reluctance, consideration, and finally a grudging recognition of its wisdom. The king had spent a lifetime placing duty above personal desire. She sensed he had hoped for a different outcome to their unexpected reunion. "You would have me send away my daughter almost as soon as I have found her," he said when Aldrich had finished. "Not send her away," Aldrich corrected gently. "Give her a purpose worthy of her unique position, a bridge between the crown and the people, between the nobility she was born to and the common folk who raised her." The king turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "And what do you wish, daughter? If all constraints of politics and position were removed, what future would you choose?" It was the first time he had addressed her directly as his daughter, and the word resonated within her like the toll of a distant bell. Eleanor thought of Oakvale, of the castle, of the mysterious sanctuary Aldrich had described. Each represented a piece of who she was, or might become. "I wish to honor both sides of my heritage," she said slowly. "The blood that flows from you and Eliza Sutton, and the values Thomas and Marta instilled in me. If Prince Aldrich's haven offers a path to do so, then I would walk it gladly." The king studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once, decisive. "So be it." He looked out across the awakening kingdom, his realm stretching to the distant horizon. "Perhaps this is fitting. The crown has stood apart from the common people for too long, seeing them as subjects rather than individuals with hopes and struggles of their own." He turned back to Eleanor, reaching out to touch the swan pendant that hung at her throat. "You were born of love, not duty or alliance. That your existence should now help forge new bonds of understanding between crown and commons seems right, somehow." As the three of them stood upon the battlements, watching the kingdom come alive in the morning light, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. The deception that had brought her to the castle had revealed truths far deeper than she could have imagined. Her identity, once so simple, then thrown into chaos, now seemed to be reforming into something new and purposeful. She was neither purely peasant nor truly royal, but something unprecedented. A bridge between worlds that had remained separated for centuries. In that unique position lay not confusion, but possibility. "The greatest nobility," the king said softly, as though reading her thoughts, "lies not in titles or bloodlines, but in recognizing the humanity in all people, from the highest lord to the simplest subject." Eleanor nodded, the truth of his words resonating with everything Thomas and Marta had taught her. Perhaps that, in the end, was the true legacy of her extraordinary journey, not a crown or castle, but the wisdom to see value in every life, regardless of birth or station. As the morning bells began to toll across the kingdom, Eleanor felt ready at last to embrace whatever future awaited her. Daughter of a king, child of common folk, and uniquely her own person. As our tale of Eleanor and King Edmund comes to a close, we're left to wonder, how often do the lies we tell in desperation accidentally reveal deeper truths about ourselves? Eleanor's journey from a peasant girl seeking mere survival to a royal daughter finding her unique purpose reminds us that our true nobility lies not in bloodlines or titles, but in how we recognize the humanity in others. What would you do if everything you believed about yourself was suddenly questioned? Would you cling to the familiar comforts of your past, or embrace the uncertain possibilities of a new identity? Like Eleanor, perhaps we all stand at the crossroads between who we were raised to be and who we might become. Each of us a potential bridge between worlds that rarely communicate. If this story touched your heart, remember that sharing it helps others discover these moments of reflection as well. Subscribe to continue our journey through history's forgotten corners and the timeless struggles that connect us all. Leave a comment sharing what you would have done in Eleanor's position. Would you have chosen the palace, the village, or forged your own path between worlds? Until our next tale, remember that sometimes the most powerful stories are those that remind us we're more than the circumstances of our birth.